Welcome to the Gourds and Pomegranates podcast, talking common sense for church communications. Here's Hannah and Joe.
One of the things we've noticed in our time working with churches is that it can often feel a bit icky, kind of the word that I like to use, to say strategy and plan and branding and words like that when talking about church, as if it's sort of too worldly a thing that we should be doing, and even suggesting that by strategizing something, we're not trusting in God's plan.
Yeah, I hear that a lot. And, of course, we want to give everything to God. We want to trust that he will guide us in what we're doing. But I think not only is it helpful to have a guide of where we want to be aiming our communications, but it's actually really sensible from a stewardship perspective as well, because we want to be making the best use of the gifts and the resources that God's entrusted to us. So we thought, as we're a podcast about church comms, it would probably be a good idea to do an episode on what's needed in a communications plan, and to do that fairly early on. So I guess that invites the question, what is a communications plan?
What is it?
Exactly. So in simple terms, a comms plan is a working document to guide all the elements of comms that you do as a church. And that will address audience, address platforms, and how that will go on to inform your content. So Hannah, why is a comms strategy something that is important for a church?
So, there are loads of reasons. I think one of the sort of few that really stick out to me when I'm working with churches are that it helps to kind of structure your content, to source ideas, and really kind of work out what to do, because social media is overwhelming for even the practitioners in it. For someone who's maybe not as native or with using online, it can be really overwhelming. So having a place that sort of like filters through what you should be creating and how to kind of find those ideas is really helpful. It helps to structure your planning with other departments and groups at church. Very often it is a few people doing loads of jobs at church, so often it is sort of the one person who does know what's going on. But actually, if you are a church that maybe has different people doing the youth ministry, the kind of community outreach, actually having a place that identifies what's going on within what happens in the church and outside of the church, that really helps to work through that.
Keeps everyone on the same page.
Exactly, yeah. It helps you to know if you're going in the right directions, to review and pivot, and you've kind of got something to work through, rather than just going, we're just going to try every platform and not have those kind of key markers that help you to really kind of reflect upon it. And then on kind of new platforms, new like trends and things like that, it helps to provide a guide of when you're trying new things, sort of whether it is the latest platform or just kind of a new way of thinking, like how we've gone from more written content to now being kind of very video driven. So it is very helpful practically, but actually sort of long term, it does offer a lot of sort of very effective and efficient ways of working.
Yeah, and I think having those goals there as well, like you said, to know you're going in the right direction. If you don't have the goals, then you're not going to know what you're heading towards. So as ever with the Gourds and Pomegranates podcast, we want to go right back to the basics. So we're going to cover the first steps of a comms plan as if you're starting from completely nothing, as if you're starting with not a lot of confidence in where you need to be going. And, we're aware that this is something that can be really overwhelming because there are lots of options of what you can do. So we're going back to basics. And before we even get into the down-to-earth practical things, the very first step is just to breathe. Don't stress. Your comms plan is there to help you, not to stress you out. It's a guide. It's something to be helpful. And it's a resource not just for you or the person who creates it, but for the leadership and everyone involved in contributing and distributing church news. So don't be stressed out by it. And don't be afraid to ask questions, find out information about different ways of doing things and how you might be able to change going forward. You don't need to stick to it just because you write it down now. It doesn't mean that it always has to be done that way forever.
Yeah. Exactly. And what you're going to work through, what we're going to talk you through as we go through this, it won't be done in the time it takes to listen to the podcast. This is not a quick and easy sort of little routine to do. It will take longer than the duration of this podcast. So even if it does end up being a bit of an extended episode, though we will try to keep it not too long, have a listen through first. Feel free to pause it and make notes, and then take your time working through it to fill out what you need to do, and then come back, listen to parts of the episode, listen to the whole episode. Again, just if you need clarity on something. So it is a bit of you've got to put quite a bit of effort in beforehand, but as we said already, it really will be worth it in the long run. So let's get into it. How do we actually go about forming a comms plan?
So I'm a big fan of starting at 0 rather than 1. So this is step 0. And we've called this prayer and buy-in. So as with anything, when you're creating your comms plan, it needs to be absolutely covered in prayer. We have this amazing responsibility.
Yeah.
We have essentially a partnership with God where he has given us this responsibility of communicating with people and reaching out to them with his message. But ultimately, saving souls is God's work. And we want to remember our place and have humility with that. So approaching the comms plan with prayer is really important. And this is also something which sets our attitude. We've mentioned before in previous episodes about having our heart in the right place with church comms. So it's not about pride. It's not about gaining the biggest audience out there. And prayer reminds us that in everything that we're doing here, we're completely reliant on God and the gifts that he's given us. So prayer, but also buy-in. You need to get your church leadership on board with your comms plan. As much as there's a place for a bit of guerrilla marketing, trying to drag your church kicking and screaming into modern communications, generally speaking, the best approach is to discuss these things with your church leaders and, if necessary, educate them on the bits that they might not understand. Your goal here is to convince them of the importance of why we should be thinking strategically about communications. Ultimately, it's a gospel work that we're seeking to reach people. And this will then help as you go on, because they'll support you. They can help with budgets and that sort of thing as well. But they will pray for you as well as as you go about your ministry of communications. So it's a very basic thing, but that first step of prayer and buy-in is really important.
Yes, definitely. Then on to step 1, which we're calling goals and gathering assets. So this is kind of now the prep work as you get into it. So to be able to set up steps, we need to understand why we're doing this, because otherwise, how will you be able to do the reviewing and the reflecting at the end of this and over the coming years as you develop your strategy further? So the first thing is to really think about what are your goals? Why are you doing not just online, but why are you wanting to communicate? Is it to build community? So you want to build a better fellowship between the church family members. You want to connect with the community outside of your church building walls. Do you want to fundraise because you want to have a new building and you really need funding for that? Is it about developing and encouraging and enabling small groups? Is it just to increase reach? Is it about discipleship and teaching throughout the week? There's no right or wrong answer. It's just about you being able to reflect and really understand what is your intention behind using, I'm going to say particularly online, but it doesn't need to be just online. It is about how you communicate with print and things like that. But really think deeply and again, pray what and how and why do you want to do this? It can be really helpful at this point to kind of map out a list of all the activities the church does. So every interaction that you're having is a method of communication. So having a big picture idea can help with new ideas as well as avoiding missing things out. So, think about what are the actual church activities. So Sunday service, small groups that go on, whether there's a kind of midweeker service. Are your buildings being used for kind of public groups? So Scouts, Guides, Brownies, Girls Brigade, Boys Brigade, whoever. Is there a Tots time group, or is there some other thing that happens on your church site or that your church is involved with? Really have a kind of big plan of what's going on.
And I think that has some crossover with vision setting as well. And I think that's why it's so important to have the buy-in from the church leadership.
Yeah.
Because if you're seeking to achieve one thing with your communications plan, but actually the church is going in a different direction, then that's not going to be helpful at all. You need to be pulling in the same direction.
Exactly. And as well, you as an individual, and having done this at my own church, you don't know everything that's going on week in, week out off the top of your head. So having that kind of map that everyone is able to contribute into, then you know when you need to be pulling stuff out from in terms of going, actually, it's Christmas. What can you do to help support what we're going to create?
Yeah. And I think actually involving other people can be really helpful at different stages of the process. And this might be a really helpful time to get other people in to brainstorm. And it might be that when you come down to the nitty gritty of what this looks like day to day, that actually that doesn't need other people. Or it might be that you feel that you've got quite a good handle on all the activities of the church. But when it comes to actually being strategic and putting this into practice that you need some help and some inspiration there. So bringing people in at that stage.
Absolutely. And then they understand why it's being done in the first place. Then think about what your wins will be. So like the why are you doing it? But then of going, actually, what will be a thing that we can go, yes, this is a good sign for us. So if it's about community and small groups, or you're more focused on really building those relationships, are you increasing your likes, but actually are you getting a lot of comments and shares? And are you getting people responding to the content that you're putting out there? Are you having people engaging with what you're doing? If it's about discipleship and teaching, are you having people either whether they're joining in with online things you're doing, but then actually turning up to church and small groups and other, not just resources that you're offering, but whether there is sort of like gatherings and things where discipleship really is a focus. Is that what you want to end up seeing? So again, having those wins set out in the beginning help you then at the end, and then as you reflect, 6 months, a year, 2 years, going, actually, yeah, these were the wins that we had set out, and this is what we are seeing or we're not seeing. Where do we need to pivot? Where do we need to carry on doing? What can we expand on? Or where do we need to reallocate resources?
Yeah, I think having those SMART goals and things which are measurable and that you can actually reflect on whether they're happening or not. Another thing to think about at this stage is about branding. And I use that in the widest sense of the word, that it's not just your visual brand identity and your logo, but your church brand as a whole, who you are. And documenting this as well is really helpful. So it doesn't need to be this massive multi-page document, but something with a few pointers to sort of the style. And so that is the visual side of things, the images that the church presents, but also the messaging. So who are you as a church family? Are you a family church? Are you full of young adults? Are you more weighted towards the older generation? Like, it's okay to own these things, even if we aspire to different things. Is mission something which is really central to who the church is? And then what does that look like? Are we talking about global mission and overseas and sending missionaries and supporting specific ones? Or do you have a real heart for local causes like homelessness or isolation or food banks and poverty and that sort of thing? This will affect how you talk about things. It'll affect the way that you prioritize messaging, but it'll also affect the language that you use and how you communicate it as well. So that's not to say that the visual parts of branding aren't important. I'm a brand designer. I absolutely think they are, but they're part of a bigger picture of who you are as a church. And again, that does relate to that vision as well, and everyone being on the same page. So I think, we've covered that step of setting goals, gathering assets together, and that's a really good groundwork. So the next step then is, who are we actually trying to reach with our communications?
We do need to mention that obviously as Christians, as local churches, as the global church, we want to reach everyone to share the gospel. That is hopefully, obviously, what every Christian has on their heart. But we do need to be strategic about it, and actually and practically reaching out to everyone is not possible. Even if you had all the resources, tech teams, content creators for every platform, and an unlimited budget for creating, you won't be able to make a meaningful connection with absolutely anyone and everyone with every single piece of content you put out there. It would just be messy, and it would be a really sort of scattergun approach. It's just not practical.
Yeah, and I think that, again, not to go back over it again and again, but vision is really important here, because you have to be realistic about who you are as a church. So there's no point being really keen on targeting students with your communications if you're not in a university town and you haven't got any students there, because you're just going to completely miss the mark. So again, with your brand, with your vision, having a good idea of who you are and your local area is really important, so that you can actually answer these next questions. So a really helpful question is, who are you currently reaching? Who makes up your current congregation? Whether that's regular churchgoers, or do you have a lot of people coming for the first time? Are we talking mainly in person? Do you have a lot of people with you online? That might fluctuate, and we're not looking for an exact answer week to week, but it's a really helpful question to ask, because you can then think about what are the interests or hobbies or even the language that people speak. Where can they be found? Are people traveling into your church on a Sunday from outside of the town and coming to the town centre? Are they spread out in villages, or actually do they all live really near to your church? Really, really helpful thing to consider is commuters. You might have a lot of young professionals in your church who live very close, but actually 60% of their week is spent in the city and they don't really have any part of the community other than the Sunday. And that is going to affect how you talk to those people.
Yeah, definitely. And then sort of it's going, who are the people that you want to reach? So again, it's asking those questions exactly again. So are they on site or do you want to reach online? Is it churchgoers you want to meet, or are you trying to reach new Christians, young Christians? Are you trying to just connect with your local community? So whether that is in your kind of immediate area of individuals, families, businesses, organisations. If you're in a particularly touristy area, so like I live in quite a lovely little seaside town, and in the summer there are loads of people there. And actually churches have a real opportunity to reach those people who are visiting, who are Christians, who they know aren't going to really be coming back regularly. They might come once or twice depending on how long they're staying for. But actually they could have a real wonderful experience with your church. Are you connecting with those local businesses and charities, organisations or service providers if you're trying to think locally for your ministries? So if you are passionate about poverty and homelessness, are you connected in with the council and organisations like that who actually connect with those people who you could really help support? And when we kind of think about on-site and online, and even like a kind of hybrid church, it's not to say you can't connect with people online if they're coming on site, and the same of like even if they're coming into the building doesn't mean you can't do things with them online. So but actually thinking, where do you want to be reaching? Who are the people that you want to see?
Part of the process of doing this is identifying the different people, whether that's internal, those already in your church, external, those that you would love to see within your church, and then the different types of that.
Yeah.
From that, we can lead on to thinking about the priority. So going back to that example of tourism, a lot of churches I work with will consider that as well, because over the summer, they do get a lot of people coming to the area. Now, that might mean that over the summer, your publicity shifts slightly. And so your website might feature a little bit more prominently about people who are just coming in for the short term and giving them that information really easily. But for the rest of the year, it might still be there, but have less prominence. And so that is maybe jumping ahead a little bit, but I'm just trying to help us think about why we're asking these questions at this point and what that will go on to inform.
Yeah.
So with all of these different types of people, one really helpful tool to think about is personas or audience avatars. And essentially what this is creating a fake person that is a typical type of person that you would want to connect with. So take someone from these categories that you've discovered in the previous step. Give them a fake name if it helps you. Give them an age, a job, hobbies, causes that they're passionate about, and actually round them out as a person. And it can help to inform how you actually then think about communicating with them. That's not to say that you have to stick to them religiously. These answers are examples, but they're helpful questions to ask about the different people types. And, by learning these things, it will help influence your messaging. So I'm going to ask Hannah to give a very brief example of what a persona might look like in a communications plan.
Yeah, so I've thought about my local area. It is actually something that we're kind of thinking about as my local church, and I just sort of thought, right, okay, who would be the kind of persona that I would put in if I'm thinking about my church and who I'm wanting to connect with as a church communicating out. So my audience avatar that I would give is a lady called Margaret. She's 55. She's married with 2 grown-up kids. They don't live at home anymore. One of them has a child, so she's got 1 grandchild. She lives in a rural village, semi-retired. She used to work for a solicitor in town. I don't need to decide what she's doing now, but perhaps she does something that is still sort of mildly corporate, but she has a lot more free time. She likes going out in nature and supporting social justice where she can. Again, I'm aware of thinking she lives in a fairly rural area. Getting involved in loads of things isn't entirely viable because there just isn't those things happening in our local area. And she regularly gives to missional causes though, which is something very likely because as well, having worked for a solicitor, she's likely to be possibly slightly more affluent. She's been a Christian her whole life, though her husband came to faith later in life. So perhaps there's not that big family, we're absolutely gung-ho for everything. Perhaps the husband is slightly resistant, so it's not always about thinking. As a family, perhaps she does a lot more stuff on her own. She's fairly tech confident for her age. She uses Facebook primarily and is fairly active on it, and occasionally uses Instagram, and she will frequently go on YouTube. I'd say that is kind of, I mean, that's what, 5 lines, a couple sentences. That's really to the extent of where you need to be thinking. You know, you could change it, but it's a good example, and that helps me to kind of just think, not what I would want to do, but what would someone who is likely to be in my area sort of be interested in, and sort of what are the things that I need to be thinking about for them.
Yeah, and I think, as you say, in those couple of sentences, we've managed to create a persona which is actually helpful, because we can think about what ministries we might want to connect Margaret with, how we might communicate to her. We can also think about what platforms we're going to use to do that. And all of these questions that we're going to go on to think about now and in part 2 can be informed by this. So personas can be helpful. Again, don't stick to them too rigidly. Don't feel worried by them, because I think it is an area where people can feel really stressed out.
Yeah.
But having a few can be really helpful. You can expand it. You know, a larger church might have more. So we thought a lot about who we're wanting to communicate with and how that might look different for different people. So the next logical step then, step 3, is what do we want to say to them?
Who knows? We could say anything and everything to them. It's so exciting. Also, like, I mean, that's the attitude we should have, but we do need to think slightly more kind of practically about it.
Well, because it's exciting, but it's also really daunting.
Absolutely, and it's not just thinking about the different people, but also kind of what we will go on to a little bit later on of like the different platforms. But one of the most important things, regardless of the people, the platforms, or however you want to create your content, is really just thinking strategically, and that it shouldn't be just about selling a Sunday. You know, come to church for the service, join us on Sunday for our service, don't miss out on Sunday. You know, it's really irritating when a business just constantly sells to you, and I think that's the same for the church. You know, we're already in a kind of position of annoying people anyway, so it shouldn't be just about trying to drag them to come into church and sort of convert them to our club. You know, there is more to faith than just a Sunday service. Share more, offer value in your content that keeps people interested in your account. And it's not a nice thing to say, but unfortunately kind of like slightly pander to the algorithm, because they like it when you mix up your content. But it will keep people coming back to your accounts, engaging with you, and it may very well be the thing that makes them decide that they want to visit your church building and become a part of your church family. So we've got kind of all these ideas that we can share, and I think kind of one of the easiest ways of really putting that down sort of on paper is breaking them into content pillars. They're also known as kind of content buckets, but they're a way of categorizing the themes of your content. Now, I've got a sample list that I use when I work, and I've kind of kept it within the ideas of thinking for a church, but equally this is not a kind of exact formula. You don't have to keep it like this. If you want to change it, you can do. But the first one is promotional or informational. Now, this is the selling stuff. So this is kind of announcements, which can be really nice stuff, like we raised this much for this mission appeal, or we're fundraising for this thing for, you know, something for the food bank or an overseas mission. And that can be really nice stuff to share, but it is kind of more, there is definitely an exchange wanted of something. But then also promoting your events, which obviously an event being a Sunday service, but also then again exciting things like Christmas craft days or carol service, church family barbecues, and anything that might happen. Just because people are part of the church, they might not always know that things are happening. You know, it is a kind of running joke within church communicators that people always say, like, I didn't know that was happening. And you go like, well, it was on the website, it's been in the newsletter, it's said every week on Sunday morning announcements and stuff. So do put that stuff out there, but don't let that be the only thing that goes out in your content. Then thinking kind of educationally, so that's kind of another pillar. And this is not so much about directly teaching people, but giving them the resources and the tools that perhaps allows them to learn more, but offers some insight into something that may make them ask questions. So an example of this might be kind of, what can you help people learn? And this could be something as easy as sharing Bible study guides, prayer examples, or sort of prayers that they can say themselves. But it's sort of something that actually, if you weren't sharing it, they might not know it at all. What are the frequent questions people ask? So actually, this is a great way of sharing other content creators to answer those big questions that people are asking. So people like Bible Society, who have fantastic resources, they're a great way of sort of answering those questions and highlighting brilliant resources that other people are creating.
So would you put sort of, for lack of a better phrase, a directly evangelistic resource or post or content, would that go into this area?
Yes, I think so. If actually people are coming away with having, I'd say, learnt something, but it's not just about pushing an agenda, but actually giving something that someone might find very helpful in their personal discipleship, or something that might be useful for small groups. And I don't think, we shouldn't hide away from our faith, but it not being about only pushing that the only way that they can learn is through a Sunday service. And I'm aware of how I'm saying, I sound very anti-Sunday service. It's not just about that, but I think actually if we equip people throughout the week, it makes what is being taught on a Sunday so much more powerful and impactful.
Yeah. But I think looking back at the previous question as well, that we've already said we've got different types of people. And so that education is going to look different to different people anyway. Straight down the middle, we're going to have a divide of people who are Christians and people who are not Christians. And talking discipleship with someone who's not a Christian is going to be a very different discussion, to say the least, to someone who might have been a Christian for 20 years.
Yeah, but even you could have people who have been Christian for the same amount of time, but have very different experiences of that faith. So you might have someone who's been a Christian and they have a secular job and they kind of, I don't want to say plod through their faith, but it's sort of, it just is, and that's fine, and that's wonderful, that's absolutely fantastic. But equally, you could have someone who's been a Christian for the same amount of time, and maybe they've not gone full on for ordained ministry, but they have gone for theology degrees, they've done loads of courses, and they kind of know a lot of things. Their experiences will be completely different, and they will know different things. So actually, the person who's not studied a theology degree or something might find those informative things quite helpful and sort of quite applicable to their life, rather than just sitting in a classroom and listening for, a couple months or something like that.
Yeah, for sure. So I think we've got those two first pillars. We've got the promotional, informational stuff. We've got the educational, and granted that look different to different people. But then the last form is sort of community information. It's engaging with people. Maybe we even call it entertainment, without that sounding too lighthearted. So things which will touch people's hearts. Ways that we can, for lack of a better word, we're not trying to manipulate, but we are seeking to get engagement from people. We want people to interact. So, having photos of people is really helpful here, obviously with permission, but rather than just having from the back of the church, actually feature people. If, again, you've got permission, photos of children and the youth activities that you've got going on, that's something which people are going to interact with because it's a personal story. We could think about testimonies and people sharing their story. That might be something that you could feature a different person from your church each month. Again, going back to what we said about mission and that side of ministry, that who are we partnering with? What does the church do to partner with them? But equally, with sensitivity, can we share information about what they're doing and inform our community, but in a way which is building those community relationships and actually engaging with people?
A word that's often used in content creation, social media, are sort of CTA, or calls to actions. And that's the kind of, can be the language, keywords that you use, but equally sort of the type of content that, I don't want to say elicits, because that sounds as if you're posting something a bit dodgy, but something that will kind of encourage people to comment, respond back. So that could be questions. So we're coming up to Christmas. Could you do what's the best chocolate in Quality Street? You could have some scandalous arguments between families within the church of people saying that the coconut one is really lovely. It's not.
Obviously it's not.
Obviously it's not the gold coin. But you could have some questions that can be, again, that kind of entertainment, those fun things, or saying what's a Bible verse that really sort of uplifts you? What's a Bible verse that you find challenging that we might be able to look at? You could do polls that are related to something that either has been preached on a Sunday, or you could ask a question that could then be used in the following Sunday, that then you can say, well, we asked this on social media, this was the response, let's not review it, but actually this is a common misconception, or this is exactly what we wanted to see and hear.
And that's a really helpful feedback loop as well, because people are seeing that by interacting online, it's not a separate world, but actually it is, it's all part of the same.
Exactly. And then it makes people feel included if they are more of one or the other, whether online or on site. Actually, they do feel that they're all a part of it. Another really lovely thing to do if, we're trying to engage with people and organisations beyond the four walls of our church is to ask for recommendations. Again, you could make that church related, but also going, so if we go back to the tourism example we said earlier on, we're wanting to share our top 5 different locations of best place for coffee, best place to visit as a holiday maker, or whatever. Actually, it's really lovely to say our church has collated a kind of highlights of our area, and we'd love you to go and visit this coffee shop because they're really lovely and friendly and they serve amazing cake. Wouldn't that be a lovely way to show your local community that your church supports them? So do these things that create a reaction from your audience. And as Jay said already, of entertainment, should we as a church? I think God has a wonderful sense of humour. So I think we should be allowed to have fun within the church. Feels like we shouldn't be saying that. And again, it's funny asking those questions of what's the best quality street, or what's the best pizza topping. That is fun, but have some Bible trivia questions or something like that that's a bit funny. Or the emoji guessing game a couple years ago, I think it must have been Christmas 2020, our church tried to do carols made up of emojis, and it was so fun, everyone trying to guess it, and sort of, they'd come up with one answer and someone say, "You're a Wally, that's completely wrong," or just people going, "I didn't know that song," or "I haven't heard that song in ages, I'm going to go and listen to it." It doesn't need to be irreverent to the church and to faith, but actually it's just having a bit of fun and engaging in social media in a way that isn't kind of just this boring exchange of text and sort of consumption, and that's it.
Yeah, and I think by owning that in your communications plan and documenting that this is the kind of content that we put out sometimes, not all of the time, it gives you permission to do that rather than having to feel guilty or sort of second guess yourself every time.
Yeah.
So I think much like the quality street or people's mixed reactions to them, variety is the key here. We've got these 3 main pillars that we've kind of sorted the different types of content into, but there's loads of different things that you can be doing. Look at competitors, for the lack of a better word. Look at other churches and look at non-churches. Look at businesses and what they're doing to get engagement, because you can be sure that their marketing departments are looking to try and game the social media algorithms in any way that they can to see what works and what gets most engagement into the top of people's feeds. So doesn't mean that you have to steal everything, but take inspiration from that, get an idea of what's popular. And we've talked about involving people from your church as well. So ask your congregation what they want to see from the church social media accounts. We have in our examples here focused on social media, but it goes for all types of communication. You might even find that by involving people that you get some buy-in from them and they want to help and volunteer their time as well. So whatever your church's content looks like, and that's going to vary depending on the day of the week, depending on who you're seeking to reach with specific messages. Hopefully putting these things down in a plan will inform what you say going forward, as well as the actual methods of how you're getting these messages out there and the different platforms. And that's something that we're going to cover in more detail in the next episode, in part 2 of this guide to putting together a comms plan.
But it's not just about getting others to engage with your platforms. You need to engage with other accounts and profiles as well. Make sure that either as an individual but also as your church account, you like and share and engage with other content creators, whether that's local businesses, schools, charities, mission partners, and kind of your ecclesiological leaders, depending on what denomination you are. Make sure that you are seen to be actively engaging with them.
Yeah, and I think that's something which often doesn't get thought about in comms plans, but is actually really critical, is that it's not just your top-down communication of the church says this on our official accounts, but actually so much of communication, effective communication, takes place on more of an equal footing. So it's interacting with people in your local area, in Facebook groups, or wherever your community is gathering, having these conversations. And it might be that is coming from the church, but actually it might be that you're really intentional personally, yourself or other people in your church, maybe the leadership, the pastor, the vicar, getting involved in these discussions in a really constructive way online, and building these relationships from there.
Yeah, that is really important. And I think if we're meant to be representatives for Christ, that actually how we're presenting, even personally, is still important, and how that reflects with how you engage online.
Yeah, and he went out into the marketplace and shared with people and shared in their lives. So this isn't us shouting from a distance away with a megaphone and that being the only way that we reach people. But at the same time, we do have these amazing platforms where we can reach people in that way. So it'd be silly not to use them.
Exactly. So as well as thinking about what we can say, we do also need to think about how do we say it. So to refer back to your church brand guidelines, it will also need to be reviewed and reflected in how you write your content. The tone of your voice, which there's always the risk of misinterpretation or someone taking it the wrong way, especially with written content. But sort of the language, or if you have a sort of particular theological grounds, they need to be established and made clear to everyone who's on your team to ensure a consistent message, across all platforms, regardless of what form of content it is, but also regardless of who's posting it, that there is this consistent messaging.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. As the team grows as well, it's even more critical to have sort of nailed a tone of voice guide. Again, it's not something to overly worry about. I've seen tone of voice guides in the past where we talk about specific spellings or specific words that we have to use every time, and that's helpful to a point, but actually if you're so focused on those details that you miss the big picture of what you sound like, then it's not helpful. So I find myself saying this a lot in this podcast, but I think tone of voice is another one of those things that probably deserves a whole episode of its own. But I think as a start, thinking about what your church sounds like is a good, helpful thing. So if you're a very formal, traditional church, then the way you speak and write should probably reflect this. Then you'll have quite a formal tone in your communications. Whereas if you're quite modern and quite trendy, then you can afford to be a bit more relaxed in how your words come across. I would just say don't feel the need to go the whole hog and start using all of the slang and whatever word the kids seem to be using these days. And man, I sound so old saying that.
But equally, sort of just to add on that bit, even if you are more of a formal church, it's not using all that language that then alienates people from not being able to engage with you because they don't have a clue what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's again that kind of being able to reflect upon the language that you're using, and that how people then expect you to be when they come to your church on site, or even if they're gathering with you online. So we know that this has been a long episode, but we hope this first part has been helpful. Part 2 will be the following episode, helping you to develop your comms plan further. If you have any questions about this episode or any of our previous ones, you can email us at hello@gppodcast.uk. But as we said at the start, remember that this is an ongoing process, so don't feel overwhelmed and just cover it all in prayer. That is really the first place to start with it all. But we're excited about what you can come up with, so Absolutely. Get cracking and join us for part 2 soon.